All right. Thank you, Debbie. So I saw a couple of questions in the chat box. I think I'm going to address those all right now. So bear with me for a second. I'm going to share my screen with you guys, if this is possible.
Okay. So for the person who asked about participants option, that's down at the bottom of your screen.
Debbie, I addressed this right now.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
All right. So welcome to our Muscadine Vineyard Management and Disease Control webinar today. This is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting. So there is not the option for you to have a camera on, but we can promote you to speak, which we're going to do later in the Q&A sessions. We have 2 live Q&A sessions. Here are a couple of the rules. If you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to write those questions into the chat box or the Q&A box. We will monitor those. And then during our live Q&A sessions, please raise your hands and you will be able to speak. Debbie has collected a couple of questions before, so we will be hopefully answering those in those 2 live Q&A sessions. And then regarding your name and your pesticide credit number, please share your name and your pesticide credit number in the chat box, and Debbie will collect those from the chat box. That's very important for us to know who is on. So even if you don't have your real name in your video box, please share your real name and your pesticide number in the chat box so that we can that you will get your pesticide credits at the end of this. So those are the rules. Very simple. The raise your hands button should be on the bottom of your screen right now. You can raise hands all the time, and then your chat box should be also, there should be a chat box and a Q&A box. Both, you can use both to answer or to ask questions, and we will be able to answer them either during the talk or at least after the talk in our Q&A sessions. So this is an agenda we have today. First, Bill Klein from NC State University. He's located down in Castle Hayne. He will talk about disease, insect, and weed control updates of 2021 in muscadines. And then I will go over some muscadine chores in summer. And we will cover all 3 things there, like if you want to have a new planting next year, if you have young vines, and we're also going to talk about chores in mostly cultural chores and fertility chores in mature vineyards. And then we have a first live Q&A, and then we have a second session on managing fruit rots on muscadines, followed by another Q&A, and that will all take together about 1.5 hours of your time. So with that, if you have any questions, please write them into the chat box. And I'll give it to Bill for the first presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'll try to share my screen here and see if we can get this talk up and going. Okay, it says I'm sharing the screen. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Are we good? Okay, very good. Wow, I want to thank Debbie and Mark for putting this webinar together, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I hope this is useful information as we go forward. What I've tried to do with this first presentation is just a brief overview of diseases, insects, and weeds, sort of where we are in the season, and some things to think about as you manage these pests, because right now is when you're doing it. And so we'll have more emphasis on disease, since that's my area of expertise, but I'll cover a little bit about insects and weeds as well. Then there will be a second disease talk where we'll focus more on the fruit rot diseases on muscadines and share some new work with you there. So to start off with muscadine diseases, you've seen this slide before, but just want to reiterate that muscadines are tough. That's why they're the grape we grow in southeastern North Carolina. Resistant to a lot of diseases that will kill bunch grapes. Very often muscadines are not sprayed in home garden or in wine production. And there are a lot of diseases that other grapes get that muscadines don't. So we've got a lot going for us to start with. The disease concerns that we have are mostly fungal pathogens that cause fruit rots, leaf spots, and dead arm wood diseases on the muscadines. We have a couple of bacterial diseases, but the muscadines are pretty resistant to Pierce's disease. And you do see crown gall disease in muscadines, but it rarely seems to cause a problem. So quite a lot of muscadines have the muscadine strain of crown gall in them, but doesn't seem to cause a problem. We've also looked for viruses and nematodes in muscadines. Again, not a real problem. We had a pretty good nematode survey a couple of years ago. So we've enumerated what types occur on muscadine, but the muscadine vines are largely not symptomatic. So they seem to be able to hold off those nematode populations pretty adeptly. Probably the biggest thing that comes into the plant disease and insect clinic at State on muscadines is abiotic or cultural problems from a poor site selection, wet soils, poor drainage. So we see a lot of that, also some herbicide injury as well. But right now we're going to focus on the diseases and mostly the fungal diseases. The methods for controlling these diseases are these. Resistance in muscadines, especially the dark fruited cultivars, just don't get a lot of fruit rot problems. Some of the things you can do to add to the ability of the vines to fight off diseases is how you manage the vineyard. You want to have an open canopy, open vineyard floor, so that you have good airflow through the vineyard, so that the vines dry after a rain or after a dew. Your winter pruning removes a lot of the infected plant parts, and that's where these fungi overwinter, is on the infected tissue that stays up on the cordon. So anything you can do to prune that out is really great. And what we'll talk the most about probably on diseases is fungicides, and that's the tool that we're using right now. We're using fungicides to prevent diseases before they appear in the field. So what is your fungicide strategy? Here are your options. Option number one is to do nothing. This sometimes works. Remember, we've got all these good things going for us with muscadines, and they're really resistant to a lot of diseases. So last year, for instance, in our fungicide trials at the Castle Hayne, at the research station, where we had vines we did not spray at all, we only lost between 5 and 10% of the yield to fruit rots. That was on Carlos for wine. And you'd have to look at that and sort of think, okay, is it worth it to spray? Most years, I think it is, but there are a lot of folks who do not spray Carlos for wine production. The second option is an organic or a low input sort of system where you just use sulfur or organic products to minimize the risk from powdery mildew, and that's your whole spray schedule. Option number three, which I think is probably the most practical one for the wine grapes, is minimal fungicide use, where you focus on early season sprays. What we found over the years is the early season sprays are the money sprays. They're the ones that really pay for themselves. And I'm talking about the sprays prior to bloom, during bloom, and on green fruit up until mid-July or so are really the fungicide applications that do the most good. Reason being, they're your protective products, so they have to be there before the disease comes. Now, option number four is the full season sprays, and this is more of something that I would recommend if you are growing for the fresh market, because you want to get the full benefit of these fungicides, and most of them will allow you to spray up to, with some exceptions, up to 14 days or so of harvest. So full season sprays, I think, for the fresh market types. The basic concepts: you want to apply fungicides before you see disease. You're going to apply them repeatedly. Once is not enough. continuously got new emerging shoots, flowers, and fruit. And so you have to make multiple applications. And coverage is critical. If you're spraying, but you're not using enough water, you're not going to get the control that you want. So what I typically tell folks is if your fungicide doesn't seem to be working for you, increase your water volume so that you're getting better coverage, because very often that's the problem rather than a fungicide that's not efficacious. So again, these are mostly caused by fungi. They're microscopic, splashing around. They need water. This is a favorite slide of mine. It's spores of the bitter rot fungus under the microscope at Castle Hayne with a human hair there for comparison. So we're really talking about microscopic particles and millions of them out in the vineyard. So you can imagine the kind of coverage you have to prevent infection with this many propagules out there. Typically, they're overwintering on old infected plant parts. So an old mummified grape that's still in the vine or the pedicel that it's attached to, really difficult to prune all that out, but anything you can remove, I think, is useful. And that's where the spores are going to be released that infect the new shoots in the spring. Just another shot of the same sort of thing. You see a lot of old dead tissue on this vine. If you look for the symptoms of these diseases, the fruit and leaf symptoms, this is something where you want to observe your vineyard over time and decide if you have the problem. If you don't have a problem, I don't tell folks to spray. You only spray for something that you have. But once you start seeing these symptoms, you need to be able to recognize them and know that this is a pathogen causing them. So the fruit rots are typically going to be a round or surface spot on the grape, and you very often see the actual fungus itself, the sign of the pathogen. If you look at the upper right corner, that bitter rot grape, you see the grape is decaying, but you also see the fungus itself. That black stuff is masses of spores. Same thing with ripe rot in the lower left. So these are what you're going to be looking for in trying to assess whether you have these problems in the vineyard. On the leaves, it's very often spots on leaves, various shapes and sizes, but what you'll see right now probably is black rot in the upper right, those round necrotic spots on the leaves. It's one of the earliest diseases to show up on muscadine leaves. So you start seeing a lot of that, you know you've got a fungal presence there and something that needs to be addressed. Another symptom you'll see is powdery mildew causing this scabby russeting on the surface of the fruit. So these grapes will not ripen normally and they'll crack open. If we look at our standard fungicide recommendations, and I know there were requests for this among the attendees, this is a real simple series of recommendations. So this is typically what I tell folks to do. I like to start with the mancozeb products because they have a 66-day pre-harvest interval. So before bloom, you're going to be using one of the EBDC type fungicides to go ahead and get that out there before the pre-harvest interval is reached. After mancozeb, I like to alternate or tank mix Rally with Captan every 2 weeks, mid-May through August. And again, if you have to skip sprays, skip them late rather than early. I think the early sprays really are the best. Where you have a problem with ripe rot, this disease shown in the picture, you may have to replace Captan or supplement the Captan with a strobilurin fungicides. And these products are going to be Abound, Pristine, or Flint, and they work really well. I was really amazed the first time I tested Flint on muscadines, and it just absolutely cleaned up everything. So there are products out there that are effective, and just a matter of getting them out there before disease appears, and making that application with enough water in a timely fashion. Now I'll move on to insects, and just want to touch on a few things here. First thing I want to say is that Hannah Barak is the entomologist at NC State. So she's the person that I turn to for Muscadine information. She covers that crop and blueberries and some other small fruits. And in talking to Hannah, she typically says that while there's a lot of insects that feed on grapevines, the grape root borer is the one to focus on and the one to control, does the greatest long-term damage. And there are other occasional leaf and fruit feeding insects that you control on an as-needed basis. This year, the question came up again, and I went to Hannah again about thrips, because there are folks using insecticides pre-bloom and going into bloom for thrips control. And again, she said that thrips generally do not require control. And if they're present in large numbers, they are usually transient on the muscadine. So if you find thrips, it's probably some other crop or some ground cover that has dried down and the thrips are on the move. And they're generally not present long enough and in large enough numbers on muscadines to require control. There have been years when we felt like we had thrips damage. I don't question that, but most years they're just not there to require control. The other insect that seems to come up a lot on muscadines is fire ant control. And where needed, you can use bait materials that are quite effective. They're slow acting, but really effective for fire ants. So those are the questions that have come up, at least to me, this spring. Just a shot of the adult female grape root borer. This picture was taken at the Castlehane Research Station. This is a female, and she's just emerged out of the ground, so her wings aren't fully expanded yet. But once the wings finish expanding, she'll fly off and complete the life cycle there. And this was around the 1st of September when this photo was taken. If you wonder if you have grape root borer problems, I think aerial roots are, as a stress indicator, may be a good indicator for grape root borer injury on the roots. So when you see a vine producing aerial roots, then you can consider that to be evidence of trunk damage or root damage. The vine is reacting to that injury. Our grape root borer control options are mounding of soil around the vines, Lore's band, or a mating disruption. And of the three, mating disruption makes the most sense to me. The mating disruption is accomplished with isomate GRB. It's a mating disruption pheromone that is impregnated into twist ties. And you put the ties out in the Vineyard 100 ties to the acre, which is basically every other vine on muscadines, and really seems to work quite well. The Lore's band application has always been problematic with the 35-day pre-harvest interval. We can't seem to put it on exactly when we need to for control. So I think mating disruption is the way to go. Just want to mention Japanese beetles quickly. They do cause obvious damage on the leaves, but usually don't affect production. So again, another insect that Hannah has not encouraged us to control. And another that, these are the questions that I keep asking Hannah year after year, but aphids are really common on muscadines, especially those new shoots growing out. You see this shoot covered with these black aphids, and there are the white waxy looking insects are larvae of a lady beetle species that's feeding on the aphids. All this goes on without causing a lot of damage to the grapes, and we don't typically recommend control for that. Again, this is something you may see as you're going through the vineyard. Now, finally, a little about weed control, and I'm just getting further and further away from my expertise here, so I'm relying more and more on my colleagues to discuss this. But this is an example of a possible weed control program. This is very similar to what we have done year after year at the Castlehane Research Station. And again, the name down at the bottom, Wayne Mitchum, is our resource person for weed control questions on vineyard crops. But what we've done at Castlehane in past years is either no pre-emergent spray at all in the spring on established vines, or Chateau, flumioxazin, in the spring. And then on young vines, we typically use grow tubes to protect the 1 to 2 year old vines. And we use a directed or shielded glufosinate spray. That's Rely, or it's got other names, which has a 14-day pre-harvest interval. And so that's our weed control in the band under the cordon. We mow the aisles as needed, hand remove the grapevine suckers, and that's pretty much all we do for weed control, and seems to work quite well. And again, some years we don't use the pre-emergence at all. I do want to throw in a caution about gramoxone injury. These 2 photos were taken several years ago, well, quite a few years ago. I think Whit Jones was the person who called with this odd injury, and said that the gramoxone was translocating and burning the veins out of the leaves. And I told him over the phone that wasn't possible. Gramoxone didn't translocate, but it sure did in this instance. So we saw where suckers on a vine had been hit with gramoxone. Gramoxone's label for sucker control, or was at the time, but if you hit them all, then you girdle the entire vine. So what you see on the left is leaves with the gramoxone burn in the veins of the leaves. On the right, you see a muscadine trunk that we peeled, took the bark off of to see where the injury was. And you can see that it's completely killed it about a foot above the ground where the spray hit from all sides. So just really be cautious with young vines with herbicides. Another picture of the same sort of thing. This was on Noble that was about 2 years old. Just burned right through the bark, girdled the vine, so the vines were starting to go backwards really quickly. And finally, I'll refer you to the Southeastern Regional Muscadine Grape Integrated Management Guide. All this information is in this guide. It's a long document, very, very detailed. And anything we discussed today about pest control is going to be in that guide. It's available online at smallfruits.org. Let's see, and that's about all I have for that for the first presentation. Mark, I'll turn it back over to you, or answer. Well, we got questions coming up, I guess, after your talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. All right. Let me share my screen with everyone. So my first question is, can everybody see that? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. So thank you again, Debbie, for putting this together, and thanks, Bill, for being here. We will go over some of the summer chores for muscadines in the next 25-30 minutes, and I tried to think about what really is important in the summer. And it's not just about managing your vineyard, but also if you plan to plant new vines, this is also the time when you start working on your soil or on your field. So we will really have 3 things to worry about in summer in muscadines. And the first one is the question: if you want to expand next year, you're going to have to start working on your soil, and you're taking your pH samples and doing a right site selection. The second part is, do you have young vines which are in their first year? You also have to manage those. And the third part is, of course, do you have a mature vine or vineyard which you want to manage? So we're going to cover all this in the next 25 minutes. And we will go a little bit about site selection and soil testing, which refers a lot to the new planting in 2022 in this case. And then we talk vine training and fertilization of young vines. And then we also do fertilization and canopy management, mostly canopy management, mature vineyards. First, site selection. Bill already touched base on that. It's very important. If you want to plant something new, and you're going to have to start thinking about it now. It depends a lot if you want to do U-pick or processing. Those are very different. They have very different needs. If you do a U-pick operation, you need to have an easy access for your cars, you have parking space, you need to have some space for children's activities. If you do processing or fresh market, but you're not having a U-pick, then you probably need more access with heavier machinery, especially for processing vineyards. You need to have access for a harvest machine. You need turnaround space in your vineyards. You need to have very wide rows so that you can go in there with the tractor, etc., etc. So those are two different things to think about if you start planning a new site for your vineyard this summer. So your market needs are pretty important. The second part you need to be aware of is your soil pH. You usually would take combined soil samples depending on your field elevation or your field soil type. We usually recommend to take soil samples all the way to 14 inches, and you split those into 0 to 7 and 7 to 14 inches. Depths, again, you do that right now, the summer before you sampling. So this would be the time where you start working on your field and take your pH sample so that you have time enough to adjust your pH before you plant your vines, because adjusting pH later is a very difficult task. So your soil pH should be, your target is between 6.0 and 6.5. You would send those samples to the NCDA agronomy lab, and they will come back with recommendations of how much lime you will have to apply on your field this summer. And then you would test again in fall to see if your pH has been adjusted or is on the way to be adjusted. This is the link, and all those presentations will be also available later to you as a PDF, so you can just click on the link and then go and find out how to take your soil samples, and your local cooperative extension agent will be able to help you with sampling your soil samples. Another issue which you need to be aware of is drainage. Water drainage and air drainage are very important for muscadines. Standing water or no drainage or hard pans in the soil or hard soil layers in the deeper soil can lead to a lot of problems later, including vigor problems. And those would be areas where I would not plant, even if the soil pH would be correct. To evaluate that, you can do that with an auger. If you give us some heads up, we will be happy to come and help you evaluating that. Again, if you start playing that in summer, that gives everybody in cooperative extension enough time to come out and go to your field and actually help you with evaluating your water drainage. That is especially true for growers who are in the southeastern part of North Carolina, where you have a lot of hard layers in the soil under the sandy soil, which can prevent muscadines from growing or muscadine vineyard from being established in a healthy and productive way. So again, you would start preparing this and doing this in summer and not just in winter. So this is also the time to start preparing your fields. Air drainage for those who are in the western part or in the Piedmont is also very important in muscadines. You do not want to plant your plants into spots where you have a lot of cold air standing or where you have barriers in a way, because muscadines can get quite some cold damage. Most cultivars can get quite some cold damage if they're planted in the wrong spot. So you do want to have good air drainage. So in our case, this would be the spot where to plant muscadines if you do want to avoid cold damage to your muscadines, especially in winter. And then another thing is, if you do plant a vineyard where you have to enter with heavy machinery or with large machinery or with big tractors or with air plus sprayers, etc., you need to make sure that you have enough turnaround space at both sides of the vineyard for your equipment. That also needs to be planned basically now, so that you will be able later to enter your vineyard with your machinery without readjusting the rows. So ripping your soil, taking out soil clots as much as possible, testing your soil for pH and for standing water. Those are the tasks which you would start doing in summer to make sure you find the good field site to plant your vineyard next year. So I want to go quick over cultivars, just a couple of things. First of all, there's a distinction between cultivars which are good for wine and juice and processing, and then a distinction and those which are good for fresh market. While you can use those which are used in, which you can sell to fresh market customers also for wine and juicing, you cannot do it the other way around. We don't recommend that. Juicing cultivars do often have very high yields. They have but a very small berry side. They have a bad picking scar, and they have often very poor eating qualities, which means the texture is not good, or the firmness is not how customers want to have. And sometimes they also do have not a very good eating taste. While there are some really advanced fresh market cultivars on the market. And again, if you want to grow a fresh market vineyard, and you want to use female cultivars versus self-fertile cultivars, a rule of thumb is a 1-to-3 ratio between self-fertile and females. There are some pollinators which are better than others, there are more and more self-fertile cultivars out on the market, which you, in this case, you wouldn't need to have the 1-to-3 ratio. But if you have female cultivars, one prime example for a female fresh market cultivar is Supreme, then you would have to have pollinators, something like a Triumph, for example, or a Tara would be a good pollinator for a female cultivar. There are some fresh market cultivars which you can cover the whole season. A lot of them are mid-season cultivars like pork, or the new cultivar Ruby Crisp, which is not on this list, but you need to contact your nursery right now to ask them if they have something for you for next year, if you do wanna plant a pork or Ruby Crisp. Most of the other cultivars will be available on shorter notice, but also in summer, if you do want to have like some of the newer cultivars which just came out a couple of years ago, ask your nursery rather earlier than later if those cultivars are available to you. The same with prawns and fresh market cultivars. There are a couple of cultivars which we recommend for fresh market at least, which you can go over the whole season with. And then the processing cultivars, which we do not recommend for fresh market consumption, are Noble, Carlos, Serena, Magnolia. Those are cultivars which we only recommend for processing, so for winemaking, juice making, and but not for fresh market purposes. So now let's move into like new vines and training of new vines. If you have new plantings which are 1 year old, you will have to train them, and you have to attend to them also in summer a little bit, not just in winter. And I will just give you a very quick overview about what the structure you want to have, because you have to keep that in mind when you're already training your young vines. So just a quick overview. So if we're talking about the structure of a Muscadine vine, this structure here, let me annotate. So this structure here, we call a trunk, and then this structure here, the arms, we also call cordons, and then those green spots here, those are the fruiting positions where we develop our fruiting spurs. And usually, if you have a Muscadine vine, you would have a spur here, a spur here, and then a spur here, and a spur here, and a spur here, and a spur here. That's not always true for all cultivars. Some cultivars like to grow more upwards, like this cultivar here, for example, has more spurs in the upwards direction than in the lower direction. And then other cultivars like to grow more downwards. But in general, is a general assumption is that you have a spur here and a spur here and a spur here and a spur here. So those are the permanent structures of a wine. And if you train your wine, you want to get to this structure eventually at the end of the 2 to 3 years of wine establishment. So what we call that a single high wire system, and we call it because we have 2 different cordons. We call it as a bilateral cordon, and we are also in a spur pruning system because we do prune those spurs, and we do not prune the whole cordon. So one important part is that if you train your wine, you have wood posts, you do want to train your cordon directly on top of the wood post. So often we recommend to plant a wine about 2 to 3 foot next to wood posts and not in the middle of the row, because those wines can get very heavy and they will lower the cordon, and they will put a lot of weight on the wire, and that will be very difficult for you either to machine harvest later, or even with management of wines that can lead to cracks and other things which you do want to avoid in your vineyard if you do want to mention it. So rule of thumb is plant your plant about 2 to 3 foot next to a cordon, next to a post, and train one of the cordons above the wood post along the wire. So as it is shown here. I can show you that. Again, here's the wood post. Here is so this is the wood post, and then right next to you, about 2 to 3 foot right next to you, that is the trunk, and that's where the plant was. That was where the wine was planted. So now, if we look at young wines, it is important that we have that 2 things are important. First of all, look at the vigor of the wines. Most muscadines, especially in the southeastern region and in Georgia, do show very good vigor. However, if you go into colder regions or more heavy soils, you might see weaker vigors at the same wines, and those wines have to be trained a little bit different than if you would have a good vigor wine. So if you have something like this and something like this, those are two different. You have to train those wines differently. If you have a good vigor wine in your first year, it is very fair to leave probably one of those cordons into the next year. If you have a weak vigor wine, please cut this wine back to like a couple of buds at the beginning and have it grow again, because this wine needs another year to be established, because it has very relatively weak vigor. Also, the root system usually has not that well of a vigor if you have a weak vigor wine. Your cordon structure at the end, again, as I said, is something you want to have a split pretty close to. You want to have a split which is in a good distance to the wire. We usually say it's about again 2 foot or something down the wire, and then you want to establish a cordon, one cordon this way and then one cordon into the other way. So that is the structure you want to go with later. You do not want to be closer to the wire, because that again will lead to some cracks, and the wire can grow later into your wine. So you do want to avoid that kind of situation. That would be the second year if you have a good vigor wine, and in your weak vigor wine, in the best case scenario, you would have something like this, and that would give you enough structure to go into the third year and start actually your fruit production. So with the good vigor wine, you can already establish some spurs in the second year, and you would have like a second cordon which goes into the other way. And with the weak vigor wine, you would probably select one of those as your first cordon in the second year. So that is really important to keep in mind. So this would be after the second year pruning, you would have some spur positions established. You would have your second cordon in a vine which shows very good vigor. In a weak vigor vine, you would have your first cordon established. Again, This is a situation which often happens in colder areas with like heavier soil. The good vigor situation is very common if you are in warmer areas with good soil drainage. Another thing to think about in summer is fertility. And as a rule of thumb, we recommend to test your soil and your plants every year as a routine task, and every spring take tissue samples and soil samples and send them to an agronomy lab. In our case, it could be the NCDA agronomy lab in North Carolina. Whole leaf samples usually are composited of 60 to 80 different leaves. Please take the whole leaf, not just the petiole, and they should be collected freshly and then sent to a tissue and nutrient testing service. Usually we do that during bloom. So now if you have different cultivars, you need to do that for each cultivar separately, or if you have different areas in the vineyard, we recommend to do this for different areas in the vineyard as well as separately. That will give you a good history of what's going on in your vineyard. At the moment, there are recommendations from the NCDA, which gives us a good idea of what the optimal ranges are in mature tissue sample, in tissue samples of mature wines. We find in our research that especially nitrogen usually is higher than the recommended rate in most, if not all, vineyards. So we're working on new recommendations at the moment, but most of those others are the ones which you should look at. And your fertilizer should be applied in a mature vineyard about 2 to 3 times per year, not later than June or maybe July in the colder areas. And you can use full spectrum fertilizer. You can mix your own fertilizer. We would recommend to do a mix of ammonium nitrate and calcium nitrate, and apply those 2 to 3 times per year. We have growers who apply it only under the wine, and we have growers who apply it, spread it over the whole vineyard. I personally think under the wine is fine, but it really depends a lot on your application technique. We're looking in young wines. We're looking at every 3 to 4 weeks, starting 2 weeks after planting. We're usually planting in April, May, June, depending on the region. And then you would fertilize basically every 3 to 4 weeks, starting 2 weeks after planting until the end of August. And what really is helpful is like a handful of fertilizer, which is spread in a 12 to 13-inch circle around the plant. And then that would be in the first region, the first year. It's also important that you keep your plants watered in the first year. So if you do have a larger planting, install an irrigation system. If you do have a smaller planting, you can water by hand. And then in the second year, you could increase that circle to like maybe 20 or 25 inches, but fertilize less frequent, maybe every 4 to 5 weeks. And then, but also keep the plant irrigated, especially if it's a weaker growth plant, and especially if you have longer stretches without rain. And then if you are in the year 3 and if the wine becomes more mature, we usually recommend to fertilize 2 to 3 times a year, depending on your petiole samples. In sandy soils, you have to use a lot more nitrogen than you would probably in like more heavy clay soils. We have growers who depend a lot on several hundred pounds per acre of nitrogen. And we have growers who don't apply any nitrogen in the vineyard. So it really depends a lot on your soil samples and your petiole samples, how much you will apply later. But that really starts when your vines are mature. In the first 2 years, we recommend to apply fertilizer no matter what, and we also recommend to keep them watered. That's the most important part, really, keep your vines watered, especially in the first year. A couple of thoughts on management. Again, fertilizing is one of your vineyard management. Don't fertilize later than June or July, because you will have that will push your plants too much into the winter. Weed control, chemical and mowing, and Bill already talked a little bit about this. Then there's some canopy management tools like hedging and skirting, which are very common in mature vineyards. And then, of course, disease and pest control, which is what Bill already talked about in his last talk. So this is a little bit repetitive because Bill already talked about this. But so Wayne Mitchum is our weed control specialist, and he's the person who really talked to you about this. So all I'm saying right now is more repetition of what I've read. But it is important to control weeds. I know a lot of vineyards are not controlling weeds very well, especially in summer. It's still very important for a lot of different reasons. The main reason is really to minimize competition for other resources, for like your fertilizer you spread, for the water you give, especially to young vines, for sunlight also. So that's important why you want to control your weeds. You want to give access to your crew and to machinery into the vineyard. And you also want to avoid build-up of potential pest populations, which then maybe come up to a level where they actually start harming your vine if you don't keep your weeds controlled. Also things like snakes or big fire ant piles or stuff like this. If you don't keep your row middles controlled, you will have a lot of that stuff in the toe, which will be later harmful either if you go into the vineyard or if you have the crew going to the vineyard. And then generally herbicide resistance is a problem, so you want to rotate your herbicides if possible. So we already talked about this. I only focus on summer here. Vine shelters or grow tubes are very important, especially in the first 2 years because of the problems which Bill just showed. So we recommend highly to put them on after winter and then take them off before winter. Don't leave your vine shelter on over winter. That will lead to a lot of damage, or can lead to a lot of damage to your vine, because you build up a microclimate in those vine shelters usually. Much more information you'll find under smallfruits.org. You will also find the pest management guide there and the Muscadine production guide listed there as well. Just some examples. This is a vineyard where you had where the row middles obviously were controlled. They were mowing the row middles, but obviously there was no undervine weed control. And you can see here, this is not a vine. This is like a tree which is growing here. There's another tree here. So please keep your row middles controlled as well. So you don't want to get it out of hand like this, because this is going to be hard to clean up. If you have a situation like this is a lot more work than just going frequently and control your row middles, your weeds in the row middles. Same here, row middles are controlled. This is landscape fabric here, but the rows are not mowed. So you have opposite thing here. You have your row middles controlled, but you do not have your you have your undervine area controlled, but not the row middles. In this case, this is actually dangerous to go in there because, as I said, of like things like snake or fire ants. So you really have to go through there and mow that before you can do any work in the vineyard, really. So also don't let it go out of hand. Invest the time and control your row middles if you can. Insect pests also. Again, Hannah Burek is our insect entomologist, so I only touch base shortly on this, and Bill already said all of that really. Scout for root borers, this is by far the most important crop pest we have because it can really kill a vine. For pheromone traps, so not the pheromone disruptors, but the traps that can be bought, are a good tool to scout for insects, especially in summer for adults. They will let those traps, they trap the root borers as they fly around, and that will give you a good overview of how big your population is. And if you see that you have a large root borer population, then that would be an indicator for you to actually start controlling those populations with, for example, the pheromone disruptors, as Bill said them. So one of those traps can usually last about 2 acres. So they're relatively costly, but you don't need a lot. So in my opinion, that's a very good tool to really find out what is your population of root borers in the vineyard. Especially in the southeast, where you do have a lot of root borers, this would be something which I would recommend to have. And then also scout for other insect populations. That is especially important for fresh market operations where insects can be a problem, not necessarily because of the damage of the vine, but because of the damage they can do to the fruit, or the secondary damage which can occur on the fruit due to insect debris. So be aware and scout for those, and contact again Hannah or any one of us if you have problems. Canopy management, another important part is, again, there are 2 parts to canopy management in summer. The one part is what we call skirting. So that is the process of trimming the vine to increase the airflow and avoid herbicides from damaging the vine. So if you want to do undervine herbicide control, you do not want to have your vine growing all the way down to actually the ground, and you want to increase your airflow to have better control on diseases, especially on bronze cultivars and fresh market cultivars, where you do have a more disease than you would have on black cultivars. Skirting should be done in late summer, whenever your vine gets vigorous enough, and you should skirt your vine knee high, so not higher than that. And just to show you how that is, so this is a Muscadine vineyard, and you would basically skirt along this line in the under vine with a hedger, so that you keep that area from growing to the ground, and you can have your weed control, and you will increase the airflow through the vineyard, which is really important with disease control and other things there as well. So this is a very important task for every vineyard manager in mid to late summer. And then another process is hedging. Hedging is the process of cutting the growth at the top and the sides of the vine. So we usually try to do that only once. Sometimes you do it twice, but if you do it too much, it will lead to a lot of lateral growth, which can be very disturbing in the vineyard. So we recommend to hedge maybe only once before harvest. If you have very vigorous vines, you want to hedge twice to allow more airflow into the canopy. Also, it allows harvest machines or picking crews to go through the vineyard more efficient. So that's also what you want to have. And then hedging should be done shortly before harvest, so that you open up the canopy and make the fruit accessible, and that you make also space in the vineyard for crews and machinery to go in there. So I'm at the end of my 30 minutes. We do have a grape portal, which you guys can sign up for. It's under grapes.ces.nccu.edu. Again, the smallfruits.org website is a very, very helpful resource. It's a regional resource put together by all specialists in the whole Southeast. And then you also will find there our Muscadine grape production guide. You also find that production guide at the NCCU website. And with that, I thank you. And then I think I give it back to Debbie, and we start our question and answer session. Thank you very much. Debbie, it's up to you.
Okay. I just unmuted myself, and if I can eventually put my picture back up. I do not see at this point any questions in the Q&A. So I think you should all feel free to take a few moments to type some questions in there. or I believe if you raise your hand, Mark will be able to respond to you that way. I'm sure you have some questions that you've just been sitting on, and we'd love to hear them.
So there is one question which says, I would like to hear thoughts on trimming the excess vine growth throughout the growing season. My thought on this is that if you trim too much and too often, you will get a lot of like lateral growth, which can be very disturbing at the end of the before harvest. So I again would probably, skirting is probably done once a year, and then hedging I would not do more than twice a year. But I let Bill chime in here too. What do you think?
Yeah, sorry, I was answering one in the Q&A.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think hedging has been or skirting has been really useful for us. The times we have messed up with summer hedging or skirting vines has been when we cut them too close to the fruit, where we got a little ambitious and cut right up under the grapes, and that's too much foliage coming off. So you start, I think you lose sugars and you lose ripening period when you hedge too hard. So stay down pretty low. I like the comment about it being knee high, Mark.
Yeah, not more than that, because you really lose fruit quality if you take too much off. That's a good point. Yeah. A question about cover crops. So I have to do some digging there. So you need to give me a minute or two. We have something on cover crops. I'll share
The
that with you.
question was, are there any suggestions regarding winter cover crops,
Yes.
crimson clover, and any impact on disease management? So how much of that has any, not much you have to do on that at this time of year, right? In the summertime. But thinking ahead on that one.
Yes, give me a minute. I need to do some digging there, but I have something. Debbie, there were some questions which you asked us in the email like a couple of days ago. Is there something which you want to address there?
There were some questions raised by people. We asked people when you registered if there were issues that you particularly had interests or concerns about. And I'm looking to see what this particular irrigation frequency was one question. Should people be irrigating their grapes at this time of year in the summer, presuming of course that there might be some drought conditions? Mark, is that something you can answer?
I wanted to give it to Bill because I'm digging here for the cover crop question.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
That.
Mark's searching for another answer for us.
Yeah.
So, as far as irrigation of muscadines, a lot of people put in irrigation systems and then don't use them much. And that's okay if you don't need it. Where they really seem to do the most good are two times. One during establishment. I think you gain between that and grow tubes, you probably gain a year getting them established by having irrigation early in the life of your vineyard. So irrigation seems to be really critical for young vines. The other time it's critical, I like to tell folks to try to get that, as we say on a lot of crops, an inch of water on the crop, either by rainfall or through your irrigation system every week of the year. And in North Carolina, we get roughly 50 inches of rain in a year's span, but we have these big gaps, these dry periods. So I think irrigating through those dry periods, which may last for 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even more. I mean, we had a long dry spell this spring yet. I think at those points, you really have to start looking at your water volume and running that system. And I think that does do some good, just watering through the dry periods. But a lot of folks will tell you that they installed irrigation and they rarely have to use it on muscadines, just because of the adequate rainfall that we often get.
Right.
There was also another question early on about ambrosia beetles, which I know I've seen on frost damaged figs. Ambrosia beetle and treatment thereof. Bill, that's for you.
Okay, yeah, they're reasonably scarce on muscadines in my experience. they tend to attack plants that have been injured, usually by cold. So the things that I tend to think of ambrosia beetle problems on are plants that are more sensitive to cold injury or some other type of injury. So we don't have a set recommendation for ambrosia beetle control on muscadines, other than to say, if you're seeing a lot of ambrosia beetle signs on the vine, it's got some other problem. It's had some serious injury to the vine at some point. Where we've seen it most often at Castle Hayne has been when we tried to grow non-cold hardy things. Our Oriental persimmons had a terrible time with ambrosia beetle following a winter cold injury. So I think you're looking at a vine that has suffered some other sort of injury, and I don't really have a good recommendation for control for ambrosia beetle on muscadines.
We have a
Right.
question here asking, should vines run east-west or north-south? Mark, that's for you.
Well, the first, yeah, I see. The first thing is really more important is the air drainage and the water drainage before you decide your row selection. So that is really your first concern is, do I have the right pH? Do I have enough water drainage? Do I have enough air drainage? And then you decide where your rows goes. And if you can, I would let them run north-south so that you have like sunlight on both sides. But that should be your third or fourth concern, really. So it's really important that you have enough water drainage and air drainage. That's the most important part. Bill, any other thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right on the money with that. So that's
Okay.
that's my answer too.
Okay, cool.
Bill, we have a question here. Thoughts on using glyphosate to control weeds around your vines?
Glyphosate is Roundup. It is a systemic herbicide. It will translocate into the grapevine, and you'll see injury that year or the year after. So I tend to tell folks to use glufosinate, which is a little bit different material that has some burn down capability and is not as systemic in woody perennials. So glyphosate is Roundup, and it's and the generics, and it's fine as long as you don't hit green tissue. But if you've got suckers around the base of the vine, I would not use it.
We have a comment here from Andy Zeman pointing out that he feels that irrigation during fruit set is important.
Yeah, that's a good comment, actually. Andy, you're right, spot on. It depends a little bit where you're at, but if you go through a drought spill, and if you want to produce high quality grapes, then that is exactly what you should do. So that in that case, again, there is like a cost to it because you have to install an irrigation system. So you need to know when you plan your vineyard, what is your aim with your fruit. But if you're aiming for high quality muscadine fruit, let's say you're a winemaker and you want to make high quality wine, and this is one of the techniques which you could use to improve the quality. Again, I think airflow in the canopy and disease management, good disease management, are as important, if not more important than that. So it depends a lot how much you want to invest into your vineyard. But yeah, no, it is definitely a thing which should be thought of, especially if we are in a dry spell and we don't have a lot of rain over fruit set.
Right. There's a question here asking, does the guide address testing the sugars? How, with what instrument, where, and when? And I don't know whether the guide does, but I can say that is exactly the topic that will be covered in our next webinar. Yes. On July 14th. What you test for, what equipment to use, how to use that equipment, what levels you're looking for. And we'll be also talking about a new program by which you can send your samples for spectrometer testing, and that's something that's been funded by the grant that supports this program. So be sure to sign up for that program on July 14th.
Yeah, so this is not covered in the guide. The guide is strictly covering vineyard management and establishment. It's not covering any fruit quality aspects. But we do have that session next month in July, where we only talk about how to sample, what instruments are we using, what is important to look at. So that seminar is coming up next month, and yeah, sign up for the seminar. There will be recording, there will be presentations, which you can look at later too. So that's coming up in a month.
Next question is current recommendations for clusters to be left on each cordon during pruning. I guess that's a winter question.
Clusters to be left on each cordon. Clusters.
Mark, is that something you can answer? Or
yeah, so I would not leave any clusters in winter in the vineyard. I would take all clusters out. I would leave buds, you know, we usually recommend, depending on the cultivar, between 25 to 35 buds per foot of cordon. That's usually what we try to do, and we try to prune 2 areas at the spur, like one on the base and then one higher up, so that we always have something to go back to if we have to cut the spur. We try not to cut the spur at all. But a good rule would be between 25 and 35 buds per foot of cordon on a mature vine.
So do some people prune clusters, say, off of wine grapes? Because I don't know anybody pruning clusters of grapes off of muscadine.
Well, sometimes you thin fruit. I mean, that's happening in summer.
Okay.
I don't know anyone who's doing that on muscadines, but maybe on. I mean, I can see that happening on razzmatazz, but you know, I would not. I mean, I don't know anyone doing that in muscadines. It's a very common thing in vinifera grapes to fruit thin, especially if you like a heavy fruit set year and you have a lot of fruit, but not in muscadines.
Okay, so no recommendation to thin your fruit in muscadines.
Not necessarily.
Okay. Couple of questions here. What are your thoughts on forcing root systems to grow vertically instead of the natural tendency of growing horizontally? And then also, have you noticed a difference in vine strength and fruit yield because of the change in root direction?
That's a great question, and I would love to know that. I personally, I don't think it's a great idea to force anything at the grape if you don't have to, but I think it is a good idea to find a way to have the root system more established in deeper layers for a multitude of reasons. But we haven't done any research on this at all. That's a research question. And I would love to know that answer. So if you know that answer at some point, just let me know. Bill, do you know anything about this?
Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind for me is how difficult it is to get roots to go down in the coastal plain in a lot of wet sites. So you wind up with this flat sort of pancake root system that has no depth at all. And so I really encourage folks, even if you have to bed the row up a little bit, to plant on a raised bed if you have to get some root penetration. So I think it's a good thing, and the better aerated the root zone is at the time you plant, the deeper they're going to go.
Yeah. So some growers, they use raised strawberry beds or old strawberry beds and plant or vegetable beds and plant their muscadine grapes in there, and they even leave the plastic on for a year, and that seems to work pretty well. And in vinifera grapes, we experiment a lot with root bags, which limits the root growth of vinifera grapes as well, and that has positive impact on vigor and also fruit quality. Yeah, I believe they do something there. They also do stuff in Arkansas in greenhouses, but I'm not very familiar with the research at the moment, so I can't really answer that question. Yes. That's what I have.
Any more questions relating to the 2 talks you just heard? We'll be talking a bit more about diseases later on. So
there's one coming in.
I saw the link shared for grape root borer, mentioning that links to the GRB traps. Are these different from the twist ties mentioned? And if so, where can these be purchased?
So the traps are different to the twist ties. The traps is what I talked about earlier. They are for monitoring. So you can use those traps. They use the same pheromone, but they're for monitoring the population. So you would have a trap every 2 acres or so, and that will give you a good overview of how many root borers you have. And if you have a lot of root borers, then you would use the twist ties to control actually the root borer population, which is very costly. So that's why you do want to monitor before you use twist ties, unless you already know you have the root borer. And I would still monitor just to know if your populations go down or not. And Bill, I think you are answering the rest of the question right now. You're muted.
Other
Bill, you're muted.
where
Bill,
can
sorry, Bill was saying something, but he was on mute.
okay. Question: where can you buy a root borer trap?
Okay, yeah, the Isomate GRB mating disruption twist ties are becoming more widely available. I'm not sure where we got ours last, but if you Google search Isomate and then capital letters GRB, or just talk to your ag chemical distributor, they're becoming widely used in southeastern North Carolina. So I think distributors should be stocking them. So that would be the place to get the twist ties, and those would need to go on sometime in July, typically,
Right.
in order to get them out before the insects start moving around. So that would be the answer on that. As far as the traps themselves, the last time I asked Hannah that, she said Great Lakes IPM was the place to order them.
Yep, true. And then we have a question in the chat box. Is overhead irrigation a bad idea? Well, it depends for what. So I don't know in muscadines. I don't know anyone who's doing overhead irrigation in muscadines. In fresh market, you have to be careful with that because it's a food safety hazard. It depends where your water is coming from, but if it comes from a pond or like a stream or something, if you do U-pick or fresh market, you do not want to do overhead irrigation because it can be a food safety hazard. Other than that, usually we have drip irrigation in muscadine vineyards. That's much more water saving and less of a headache as well. So that's my answer on that. But I'm only here for 4 years, so maybe there is something historically which I don't know, Bill, where they used overhead irrigation muscadines or something. Do you know anything about that?
I do know that, you know, when you overhead irrigate something like muscadines, you're mostly watering the middles between your rows, right. And encouraging all that grass to grow, and you're not getting it to the vines.
Right.
The food safety is an important consideration if you're pulling that water from a pond. And certainly, you know, one of the great benefits of drip irrigation is it does not get the leaves wet, does not encourage any leaf diseases or anything like that in crops that have that problem. I mean, drip's great stuff, especially for a crop like this, if you have to irrigate.
Good answer, Davey.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm not aware of any overhead on muscadines right now. And
question, it appears Japanese beetles are damaging the fruit bodies on the vines. Suggestions for spray, and would it be prudent to spray the beetles? That is a question for you, Bill.
Okay. Yeah, we at our research station in Castle Hayne, we used to go out and bump the wire with your hand to look for Japanese beetles. And when you do that, the beetles just drop off the vine and swarm, and you say, "Oh my goodness, I've got to go spray." What we found over time is we really don't have to spray to control them. They eat a lot of leaves along the cordon in the interior of the vine, but don't seem to impact the fruit much. I've got great pictures of them eating flowers, but it's usually the late blooms. Usually the Japanese beetles don't show up until after bloom at the coast. Now, that being said, if you can see you have a Japanese beetle problem, there are insecticides you can use to control them. And I would send you to the smallfruits.org website. I'm looking there right now under Japanese beetle. It lists 7 as a possibility, which is probably the most common thing to find. Danitol, Admire Pro. So a lot of products are labeled for Japanese beetle. You know, our message here is you generally don't have to control them, but if you find yourself in a situation you need to spray, then there are products out there, and 7's probably going to be the easiest one to find.
Yeah, Debbie, a lot of growers also use Danitol to control things like this. So 7 or Danitol, those would be the 2 go-to, I would say. And then Chuck is asking for numbers per foot of spurs per foot on each corner. So that depends a lot on how you what your structure is. So you cannot force that really. So it depends on your cultivar, how vigorous your cultivar is. We're trying to shoot for like maybe 3 to 4 spurs per foot. Usually 2 would be something which I would feel comfortable with, and then you know, once you have established those positions, you keep those positions. So you're not going to establish a new spur every year. You're going to keep that spur. So depends a lot on the vigor of your vine. If you have 2 nice positions on the foot, and you can establish between 20 to 30 buds per foot, so maybe, you know, 15 per spur, that's kind of I would say the minimum. And if you can do that over 3 spurs or 4 spurs with the same number of buds, like about 25 to 35, then that would be nice. You know, it depends a lot how your plant is growing and how you do want to have your spurs established. But you keep those spur positions. You're not going to establish a new spur every year. Okay, and then to the cover crop, I know we're running super late. To the cover crop question, very quick. We're working on an undervine cover crop publication, which is not published right now, but we have like some parts here. So I can just tell you what we know from research in vinifera vines, which might help you a little bit. And what we found here in North Carolina on research, well, I didn't found it, like a colleague of mine found it. His name is Gil Giese. He was with the Surrey Community College, and he found in a very long study, like 6-year study, that things like where's this here? Things like orchard grass or tall fescue, red fescue seem to work very well. Buckwheat seems to work very well, and sheep or hard fescue worked very well as well. And perennial ryegrass was another one which seemed to work okay. And then we looked at alfalfa, chicory, and radish as something which might also work as undervine cover crop. But there's not a lot of information on that as well. So, but the fescues usually can go pretty well as a cover crop. And buckwheat seems to work very well as cover crop as well. All right.
So why don't we move on and let Bill do his next talk, and then can answer any more questions after that talk.
Yeah, we're running a little late. So Bill, I give it to you.
Okay, thanks again. I'm going to pretty much skip to the end of that talk. A lot of that was just a deeper dive on the fruit rots, and we've covered much of that material already. So what I'll do is get that talk up and then share the screen, and we'll pretty much go to the end of it because there's just a few things I'd like to cover in the time we have left. So let's see here.
I know for fresh market, this is a big deal. So, you know,
yes, so I'll what I'm going to do is try not to make everybody seasick there with all my fast scrolling. We talked about controlling fruit rots earlier, and about how some cultivars or some of the wine grapes folks didn't spray at all. But we wanted to circle back to that topic because fruit rots are a big deal on the fresh market cultivars, much more so than on the wine grapes. So just like to spend a little time, again, a lot of these slides you've already seen. These are microscopic spores. They're overwintering on the vine, and they're producing rots on the fruit. And the one in the lower left corner, ripe rot, I just want to mention it's called ripe rot because it tends to spread at harvest. So if your grapes are getting a little bit overripe, you've got moisture out there in the field, you've got people handling these grapes, getting the spores all over their hands, you can move that fungus around quite a bit and really cause problems for yourself with fresh market cultivars. So wanted to spend some more time on that. There's another shot of ripe rot at harvest. You can see these pink orange spore masses on the fruit. You move them around, insects land on them and move them around on their bodies. They rain splash around in the vineyard. So for fresh market cultivars, really have to stay caught up on harvest so that you don't have overripe fruit hanging out in the vineyard. And also you want to try to head this off as much as you can with fungicide applications. So I'm going to skip ahead to sprayer types. Wanted to mention a little bit about this. This is a cool picture because it's a sprayer that has two different types of head, a cannon on top and a air blast on the bottom that blows upward. They're both air assisted sprayers, but the one on top works great for blueberries, but not for muscadines. If you spray down at a muscadine canopy, it's just going to laugh. You can't penetrate those leaves. You want a sprayer that is spraying up from the bottom so that you loft that foliage up and you contact the fruit with the fungicide spray. And so something like this, as you see on the right, the air blast blowing upwards. You can also do this with a high pressure sprayer, but you have to use a lot more water to get the kind of coverage that you need. Again, this is spray timing for muscadines, a lot simpler than vinifera. Start in mid-May when the shoots are 6 to 10 inches in length. You can start even earlier than that, but that's when I really start getting concerned, is when those shoots are extending and the flowers aren't open yet. And again, early sprays do more good than late sprays. There's always a tendency as you get close to harvest to say, wow, which fungicide has the shortest pre-harvest interval so I can spray really close to harvest. Those are not the most effective sprays. The early summer sprays are the ones that are controlling, especially ripe rot. It infects grapes when they are young green grapes, and the infection remains latent in the grape until it ripens. So you're really not controlling it late in the summer when those grapes are late green stage and starting to turn color. They're probably already infected if you've got a ripe rot problem. So again, here's our standard mancozeb and then alternating rally and captan. And I also wanted to just quickly share some information about new products, because we talk about our standard fungicides that I keep recommending year after year, and those are on the left. But what myself and Phil Brannon at University of Georgia realized was that there were a lot of fungicides out there labeled on grape that had never been tested on muscadine. So that whole list on the right side, just fungicides we didn't have any information about. And what was intriguing to us is if you look at the column that says FRAC code, those are all these different modes of action that we could be using for disease control on muscadines if we only knew if these products were safe and efficacious. So in 2020, we evaluated all those products you see on the right and got some good information out of them. And I'm applying them, spraying again, need to actually spray them in the morning again at Castle Hayne just to test it for a second year. But these were our findings, way more than you can read through there. But this is the whole list and the diseases we were looking at. So ripe rot, bitter rot, macrophoma rot, and then that fifth column over says percent marketable, and that's a really useful number there because it takes into account all the rots. And what I'll do is I'll just light up the things that worked. And so on this slide, everything that's sort of lavender colored there is where the fungicide worked better than doing nothing. And so some of them did, some didn't, but it's real exciting to me that most of these products were safe on muscadines. They didn't cause any damage, and most of them worked to control these diseases. Now, unfortunately, that first column is all in gray where it says ripe rot. We didn't have enough ripe rot to really get a good evaluation. But some really interesting things in that column. You see a lot of these fungicides have less than 1 in that percentage. So I'm intrigued that the product called Switch has 0 ripe rot. Miravis Prime, 0.3%. You go down to Maravon, 0.8%. So there's some really good efficacy out there. We couldn't show it statistically, but some of these fungicides I think are worth a look on muscadines. If you go to the column that is the fifth one over, the percent marketable, untreated control, the top number was 86.8%. Now this is on Carlos. And then you start looking down through the fungicides, you see they get up into the high 90s. So something like Miravis Prime, 97.7% of the grapes were marketable. That's a pretty good difference. That's over 10% increase in marketable fruit. And the last two columns, angular leaf spot, just about everything controlled it really well. So our leaf spot diseases, we've got a lot of products that will work quite well for that. So again, these are new products we evaluated in 2020. We'll look at them again in 2021. I would have no problem recommending any of these with the stars asterisks beside the name for you to try this year if you want to take a look at some of these products. But we're trying to get another year's data on them before we put them into the spray guide. Just want you to be aware that there are products out there, and if again, I want to say, if your standard fungicides you feel like they're not working, before you switch to a new product, or before you say the standard fungicides are no good, think about how much water you're putting out. Is it enough? Are you getting the coverage that you need? Because the old standards, the Cap-10, Abound, Pristine, Flint, Mancozeb, all are really good and work really well on muscadine if you get the coverage that you need and if the sprays are timed when you need to hit them. So lots of tools out there for fruit rot control. And I'll stop sharing. That's all I had there. And we're probably close to out of time, but glad to answer any questions now or in the future about these fruit rot diseases. And again, we'll have more information about those fungicides over time.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Right on time. So if there are any more questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box or the Q&A. Anything else which you want to mention, or raise your hand. And but there's also, you can always reach out to Bill or to me or to Debbie if you have more questions. We're happy to answer those, or you go directly to your cooperative extension agent in your county. We have a lot of very knowledgeable agents on muscadines as well, so feel free to reach out to them as well. And I hope
just a reminder to people that if you wanted pesticide recertification credits and you have not given us your number and your name, now's a good time to type that into the chat box.
Yeah, so I will stop this recording now, and then I will give you guys 10 minutes more to put in your number, pesticide number, a name, a license number into the chat box so that we have everybody covered. And I thank everyone for your time that you spent with us, and I hope to see you all soon. And the webinar is officially ended now, if there are not any other questions. All right, thank you.